Hello. Talking to you. Right there. Sorry. Hit the button to record and then my phone went bing. So, this is part 2. There are some incidents about to happen. So let's find out what is about to happen. Which incidents?
In May, there had been an unexplained temperature rise in the number 2 pile, and 4 months later, smoke was seen coming from the core of the other reactor following a shutdown. It turned out that the smoke was simply caused by oil particles being blown onto the hot graphite from the cooling fan bearings. But the unexpected temperature rise was a worry for scientists. Consultations were carried out with the Americans, and it became apparent the cause lay in the release of Wigner energy, exactly what Harwell had been warned about 3 years earlier. A month later, on the 3rd of October 1952, the first British atomic test was carried out aboard a ship moored off the northwest coast of Australia using plutonium from Windscale. For the politicians and scientists, it was a triumph. Britain had gained entry to the nuclear club.
Building the bomb seemed just the natural thing. It was one of the great powers, in spite of being greatly weakened by the economic costs of the war. But still, it was a kind of natural thing, and hardly anybody opposed the decision. Of course, it was carried out in secrecy. There wasn't a great public debate about it. It just sprang from a certain assumption that, yes, well, Britain should have the bomb. And the British did, in fact, expect to be the second to develop an atomic bomb, and were very taken aback by this.
Alrighty. Please drink responsibly. I never drink responsibly.
An atomic bomb, and were very taken aback by the Soviet test, which came in 1949, where the first British test was 1952. And Western intelligence had in fact predicted that the first Soviet test would probably be 1953, maybe 1954. So the British then suddenly found that they weren't the second nuclear power, they were now the third nuclear power. And increasingly through the 50s, especially after both the United States and the Soviet Union developed the hydrogen bomb, again Britain, was then again lagging further behind. So I think the 1950s were a period of some tension in British nuclear policy, because there wasn't a fundamental revision of assumptions saying, oh, we shouldn't have these things at all, we can rely on the Americans, or we don't need them, or they're immoral, or whatever. So the government didn't go that far. On the other hand, it was finding it very difficult to keep up in this race, or to stay in this race, when the United States and the Soviet Union could mobilize such massive resources into not merely developing new kinds of weapons, but building large numbers of them, and delivery vehicles and so on. So I think it was a very difficult period for the British.
Throughout the mid-50s, atomic tests were carried out by...
But to be fair, it's understandable. You just got out of a war. It seems like you're asking an awful lot in such a short period of time. But, that's just me.
Each of the 3 nuclear powers. The Windscale piles remained the only production source of plutonium in Britain, and there was heavy pressure on the Atomic Energy Authority production group, not only to meet demand for that element, but also for others, such as tritium and polonium, required for the testing of a hydrogen device. So 2 reactors of a new type, cooled by carbon dioxide rather than air, were commissioned next to the existing piles, and construction work began in August 1953. 2 years later, the need for plutonium had become so desperate that a further 6 of these Magnox reactors were ordered. Meanwhile, a system had been developed to deal with the buildup of potentially hazardous Wigner energy in the graphite core of the Windscale piles. After every 30,000 megawatt days of irradiation, it would be released by a process called annealing. Although the technique occasionally threw up a problem, generally it worked well. But then, in October 1957, there was the accident scientists feared most. During the 9th anneal, the worst-case scenario, predicted in 1949 by Wigner and Teller, came about. The number 1 pile caught fire.
Jeez. It caught fire. It's not good.
By the beginning of October 1957, 8 anneals had been carried out to release stored Wigner energy from the 2 piles. But scientists had noted that some had been less than fully successful. Occasionally it was difficult to balance what had been described by Edward Teller as the Wigner instability while the anneal progressed. And despite the opening of the Calder Hall reactors the previous year, there was still a tremendous pressure on the piles to produce plutonium along with a growing number of isotopes for research work. There had been a further 13 British atomic tests since Hurricane in 1952, and the first trial of a thermonuclear device was scheduled for the following month.
Scheduled, I love
The government
that.
was enthusiastic about the status and world-standing nuclear weapons conferred. The previous July, Prime Minister Anthony Eden said, "It is on the thermonuclear bomb and the atomic weapons that we now rely not only to deter aggression, but to deal with aggression if it should be launched." Things seemed to be going well in the military program, but unbeknown to those who controlled the Windscale piles, the warnings of Teller and Wigner, warnings which at the time had been largely ignored, were about to lead to the world's first major nuclear accident. On the 7th of October 1957, the number 1 pile was ready for the 9th anneal. Just before midday, its cooling fans were shut down, and the first of the control rods were run out to introduce nuclear heating into the lower part of the pile. It was this process of heating the graphite which allowed the displaced carbon atoms to return to their normal position, an action which itself introduced a further heating effect. In the early hours of Thursday the 10th, a monitoring device on the weather station roof showed an increase in radioactivity. But it wasn't until a second, larger release that the operator's suspicions were aroused. It coincided with a further rise in the pile temperature, and it was obvious to all that number 1 pile was in serious trouble. When 4 channels were opened up to eject the uranium fuel rods, they were seen to be glowing bright red. There could be no doubt now that the pile was on fire.
The decision to look into the reactor was taken by a man called Tom Hughes, a colleague of mine for many years, sadly with us no longer, and he was second in command to me on the operations side. I was second in command to Davy overall, and he made the decision, quite a brave one, to have a plug pulled out and look into the reactor. And this was to look at a channel where a thermocouple was showing an increasingly high temperature and had been doing for about the last 48 hours.
What?
And he didn't see flames, but he saw four channels of fuel elements. Each plug you pulled out gave access to 4 channels of the fuel elements, and they were all, the ends of the ones you could see were all glowing red.
So Tom
This had been happening for 48 hours? Oh.
Chewy set off to drive to Windscale to assess the condition of the number 1 pile for himself. Wearing a mask and air bottle, he climbed the 80 feet to the top of the reactor building to see exactly what was going on inside.
From the roof you could look down through 4 inspection holes. And I went up there and looked down, and there were no flames coming out of the back of the reactor at that time. But there was a dull red glow. And during the night I climbed up several times, and flames began to flicker out of the channels, and they were quite modest to start with, but eventually there was just a raging inferno at the back of the reactor. And the flames were impinging upon the wall across what was called the water duct. There was we pushed fuel out of the horizontal channels in the reactor, and they fell down into skips which were underwater. Well, the wall on the other side, flames were impinging upon this. And I remember that one of the civil engineers had said to me that if that wall exceeded 600 degrees centigrade, the roof on which I was standing could collapse, which wasn't a very pleasant thought, but I didn't really believe in.
Tom Hughes had already discharged some of the uranium cans around the fire to try to stop it spreading. Chewie decided an attempt should also be made to eject those at the heart of the fire, by pushing them out through the back of the reactor using scaffolding poles. But they refused to move, however hard they were pushed.
When these were pulled back onto the working area, the charge hoist, they were red hot. And on one occasion, when this was happening and a pole came back, there was also molten metal dripping off the end of it, which had to be molten irradiated uranium. And of course this was causing a big radiation problem on the charge hoist itself.
The situation was critical and called for immediate action to bring the fire under control. The problem was, how could this be achieved? There was a great deal of discussion about the options available, but at the forefront of everybody's thinking was an overriding need to exercise extreme caution to avoid increasing the spread of radioactivity.
Well, the nice thing to do would be to have large quantities of inert gas to try and feed that in, but then feeding it in wasn't going to be easy anyway. And we discussed the use of carbon dioxide. It so happened that a tanker had come into Calder Hall that day with 25 tons of liquid carbon dioxide, so that we had plenty of it. But I had done some experiments at the fuel plant down in Springfield, trying to put out hot metal fires with different types of extinguisher, including carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide had no effect. The only other thing that we had available was water. And we were not too enthusiastic about putting water onto burning graphite, because you can produce a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen.
I'm going to guess the steam. See, my first thought was water. And I'm going to guess when that water hits that, it turns to steam and maybe blows up some particles. That's the only thing I can think of. But I'm not an expert.
Carbon monoxide and hydrogen, which under certain circumstances can be explosive.
Oh.
So carbon dioxide was tried first. A hose was set up on the charge hoist to deliver the gas directly into the burning channels. It was a hazardous task, requiring the operator to be right up against the face of the reactor so the CO2 could be delivered and its effect monitored. But the results were disappointing.
And it had not the slightest effect. Just went on burning as merrily as ever. So carbon dioxide wasn't any good, even if we had a means of delivering it in a large quantity, which we didn't. So the only thing we were left with was water.
A hose was wired to a scaffolding pole to allow the water to be delivered into the burning channels. Chewie listened anxiously for any signs of a hydrogen reaction as the pressure was turned up to maximum.
And I went up to the top of the reactor once again for the umpteenth time. I looked down the back, and there the water was, most of it was shooting straight out the back of the reactor, and as far as I could see, making absolutely no difference to the fire. So I had the pressure reduced so that the water at least was sinking in through the graphite blocks onto the fire. But it wasn't the water on its own that put the fire out. It was eventually shutting down the cooling fans that had to be on if men were working on the charge hoist, on the working area. The ventilation system was such that if you didn't have the shutdown fans running, then you could get radioactive contaminants coming back from the reactor into the working area. With the shutdown fans on, the airflow was from the working area into the reactor. So we had this horns of an enormous dilemma, a raging inferno in the heart of the reactor, and yet we were supplying air to it.
The operators were fighting hard to cope with a situation for which they had never been trained. But once the area was evacuated and the shutdown fans turned off, it seemed at last that the battle to put out the fire was being won.
And I was up then on the top of the reactor looking down the back, and the effect was dramatic. I could just see the fire dying away. The flames were licking against the wall across the water duct, and I could see them actually dying back. And I went up and inspected several times, and the water went on at about, well, just before 9 o'clock in the morning. And by noon I was satisfied that the fire was out.
I was going to say, if you shut it down and you've run out of options, what do you do then? Because it's not like you can, okay, well, you know, get on the phone and dial the operator and get in charge with the nuclear department and ask them to troubleshoot what happens here. Oh no.
Whilst the battle was going on inside the pile building to fight the fire, health physicists had begun to assess the dangers caused by the release of radioactivity. There were 3 ways in which the population outside the plant could be affected: by external radiation, inhalation of radioactive material, or through the food chain. It was quickly realized that the biggest danger came from the ingestion of iodine-131, a radioactive isotope with a half-life of about a week. Its intake would lead to an increased likelihood of thyroid cancer, and children were the most vulnerable.
The route from deposition on ground through grass to the cow to milk to child is a very effective route. A cow covers a great deal of area grazing, and it collects the iodine from a big area, concentrates it in the milk, and then children, young children, if they're drinking cow's milk, then get a substantial intake. So we were very much concerned with making sure that the milk that was significantly contaminated didn't get to these children.
In retrospect, it's astonishing there was no calculated safety limit at the time for the intake of iodine-131. If anyone had given thought to the consequences of an accident at the Windscale site, no research work had been done in Britain to give scientists a baseline from which they could operate.
It seems like they were working so hard to be number 2 that they were disregarding a lot of things. And of course, you know, some of the things maybe they didn't have all the knowledge about. I'm going to end this shortly, but not right now, but pretty quickly.
In the United States, the minimum distance between plutonium factories like Hanford and surrounding populations was laid down in the siting requirements. But in Britain, the agricultural areas of West Cumbria went right up to the Windscale fence. So during the night, a small...
Yeah. There's a lot more land here that isn't used in the U.S. So I could see why it's, you know, you could get away with that. In England, you just kind of packed in.
During the night, a small group began the task of working out what a safe limit for iodine-131 in a child would be. And it was using these hastily calculated figures that the area of worst contamination was defined. Milk from farms within it was disposed of, largely by dumping it in the sea, and fresh supplies were brought in from outside.
The whole area was about 200 square miles, and at the peak areas, which was just slightly to the southeast of the Sellafield site, figures in milk went up to about 10 times the figure we'd set as a trigger level. So we needed to act, there's no doubt.
In the area around Windscale there was little alarm. The operation to replace contaminated milk with supplies from elsewhere worked effectively, though gradually the size of the affected area was increased. News of the milk ban, along with initial details about the fire, was released at a press conference the following Sunday. The reaction was muted, and although restrictions on milk supply continued for a little over a month in total, the greatest concerns seemed to come from those living away from the immediate area.
Basically, the problem got worse, the public relations problem got worse, the further away you got from Sellafield. And the peak problem was undoubtedly where people living in the south had got children in boarding schools close to the area. And they were certainly very worried. But generally speaking, the people in the area weren't, because they could see life was going on in the ordinary way.
I'm going to go ahead and stop it here, and we will return for part 3. And that fire part was really getting me. 48 hours, and I was thinking, oh. All right, so I'm going to end this here. Like and subscribe, and till part 3, have a good day, have a good night.